Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the New Liberal Podcast, part of the Center for New Liberalism. I'm your host, Jeremiah Johnson, and joining me this episode is Richard Kahlenberg. Rick, welcome to the show.
Oh, well, thanks so much for having me, Jeremiah.
So we're here today to talk about your new book, Class Matters. And this is interesting because it's something that I will admit I have not really been deeply involved in this area of policy. I know that you have been for quite a long time. You've written multiple books about this subject. You've been thinking about it, I think, probably off and on since you were in college or in law school. And the book is about basically affirmative action as it exists in the United States, or as it has existed, and whether or not it is well designed, whether or not we should be using a system of race-based affirmative action, or whether, as the title somewhat implies, we should shift towards a form of affirmative action that is focused on class rather than race. But before we jump into the actual meat and potatoes, like why is this good policy or bad policy, I'd be curious, to hear your story in terms of why were you originally interested in this? Because part of the book is just detailing your own journey, and it starts all the way back when you were a young, spry, 20-year-old in college or whatever, and you first started thinking about this a long time ago. Why has this been such a thing for you? Why have you been interested in it for so long?
Oh, well, thanks for that question. So I wrote my thesis in college in the 1980s at a time when Ronald Reagan was riding high in the American political environment. And I wrote it about Bobby Kennedy Sr., whose 1968 campaign still inspires me. Bobby Kennedy ran at a time when working class people were deeply divided. The old Democratic coalition of working class white, black, and Hispanic and Asian people was coming apart. And Bobby Kennedy was kind of the last gasp. He was the one who was able to hold it together. He had strong support from black voters, from Hispanic voters, for his strong support for civil rights. But he also got a lot of working class white voters, some of whom had voted for the segregationist Governor George Wallace. And so I was intrigued, how did he do this? How was he able to hold that beautiful multiracial working class coalition together? And the short answer is that he framed issues in terms of class rather than race. He was trying to look at the common concerns that working class people across racial lines felt. And in that, he was borrowing from Dr. King, who also wanted a multiracial working class coalition. And so as I was a student in college, I'm looking around at the policies that are being discussed, and it was very controversial that colleges were providing a preference based on race rather than class. And so it seemed to me that applying the thinking of Dr. King, of Robert Kennedy Sr., to the issue of affirmative action logically would mean that we'd want to give a break to economically disadvantaged students of all races. But what seemed like a simple and straightforward idea to me was anathema among a lot of my liberal friends. And so I've been struggling to try to bring them along all these long years.
Let's talk about that for a second, because I think many people who are of a liberal or left persuasion would be surprised at not just how controversial affirmative action has been today and in the last 10 years, but I think they would be surprised by how controversial it was even at the beginning. It kind of became a liberal piety at one point, just a talking point that virtually, I don't want to say every Democratic politician, but we'll say the vast majority of Democratic politicians stood up for in the last 15, 20 years. But when it was first proposed, as you said, there were kind of these competing visions of what affirmative action could do. Could you talk about the camps? Because part of what makes this book so fascinating is not just talking about policy, but it's the history behind it. What were the original camps in terms of, okay, the civil rights is happening. We're about to pass, it's the 60s. We're about to pass the Civil Rights Act. Jim Crow is on the way out. And lots of people think that, okay, well, now we need something else beyond just, okay, we're going to guarantee your rights. We also need something else to make up for what we've done. What were the visions of that? There were some different camps and there were people with different ideas. What was happening in the 1960s?
Yes. Well, there was a fascinating split within the civil rights community on this question. So everyone agreed, as do I, that you have to do something to remedy our history of racial oppression. Uh, there were centuries in which African American people were mistreated in the most egregious manner. And it was not enough to pass civil rights laws. Something proactive, some kind of affirmative step had to be taken to address the history. Uh, some people said that it should be that we should adopt a system of racial preferences. So Whitney Young, who was one of the key civil rights leaders in the 1960s, uh, called for a decade of discrimination in favor of Black people. James Farmer and others in that camp said racial preferences, actually racial quotas, were required to compensate for past discrimination. Then there was a second camp, and the most important members of that camp were Martin Luther King and Bayard Rustin, and they argued that we need to take affirmative steps to address the history of discrimination, but those steps should be economic rather than racial in nature. And there were a couple of insights that King and Rustin had. One is that uh, the any economic program will disproportionately benefit the victims of discrimination. That is to say, it's precisely because of a history of discrimination that Black and Hispanic people are disproportionately low income and working class, and therefore would disproportionately benefit from an economic affirmative action. And so it wasn't, economic affirmative action doesn't ignore the racial history. It seeks to address that history. At the same time, King and Rustin said, uh, that racial discrimination is not the only form of unfairness in American society, and that poor whites also suffer from deprivation, and that they deserve a hand up too. So King said it was a simple matter of justice that poor whites should be included in any effort to move forward on our project of providing equal opportunity. And the other important insight that King and Rustin had was political. That they were seeking to build upon the 1963 March on Washington's coalition of labor and civil rights groups. It was a march for jobs and freedom, both of those things. And Rustin said the worst thing you could possibly do to, if you were interested in preserving that coalition, was to tell working class whites that even the most economically advantaged Black and Hispanic people deserve more support than you do. That would be disastrous for the progressive coalition, and I think that was very prescient. I mean, that I think is a big part of why Democrats have had such a hard time reaching white working class people, and increasingly, these days, working class Black male and Hispanic people as well, who really haven't been helped by affirmative action, race-based affirmative action that programs that tend to benefit more privileged Black and Hispanic people.
Let's start with the policy itself. One of the many objections that I can imagine people raising to this is, okay, well, I'm against, racial quotas and I'm against, giving people extra bonus points on their application because they are of a certain race. But why should we have any form of affirmative action? Why do we need class-based affirmative action? I can imagine someone saying, shouldn't we just hire the best people for the job no matter what? And shouldn't we just select the best students no matter what? That just do merit on its own rather than having any form of leg up for anybody.
Right. Listen, I'm for merit. I believe that it's enormously important that we try to identify the most talented individuals to fill certain positions in the workforce and in education. Uh, but I think there's a lot of empirical evidence to suggest that if you're looking for true merit, you have to consider the obstacles that someone has overcome in life. So just to make this concrete, let's say you have a couple of students who are applying to college and they have they have a certain record of SAT scores and grades and extracurricular activities. Uh, those scores and grades and extracurriculars mean something very different for someone who grew up in a single parent home, uh, went to under resourced, disadvantaged schools, and managed to do pretty well despite the obstacles, as compared to someone who on paper looks slightly better, but had everything given to them in life. I think most people intuitively understand that. And there's good empirical research to suggest that if you're trying to measure the potential of the true merit of an individual, you have to consider what hurdles they overcame in life, in addition to what academic record or work record they've put together.
I think that's a really solid answer. I know that some people are going to raise that objection. So it was worth talking about before we get into the rest of it that, the idea of merit in and of itself is complicated and it's not one dimensional and it requires context and sometimes politics is the death of context, right? Everything turns into a 5-word slogan, but uh I don't know. It's one of those things that you got to jump over the first hurdle before you can talk about the more complicated stuff, right? So we've got this situation in the 1960s where there's kind of these two camps. One which is advocating for a more class-based approach, and one which is a little bit more like racial quotas. And it ends up not exactly being racial quotas, but you might argue that de facto many educational institutions or even some government jobs for a while were kind of like de facto quotas. And I think that this is because people, had a legitimate instinct that there's like a wrong that needs to be addressed. If the legitimate injustice is that society has been discriminating against black people for hundreds of years, obviously enslaved them, segregated against them, don't we need on some level to ensure, at least for you could argue at least for a little while post 1960s, that they are getting places in our most important institutions, whether that's the government, whether that's high level universities. It, is that, I guess, first, is that an important goal to ensure that they're represented? And second, if we're not going to do that via racial quotas, then how should we do that?
Well, I agree that it's important that our institutions be racially integrated, that they be open to all, and not simply replicate uh, the effects of past discrimination.
And I guess I'll like clarify here my thinking, which is that there's part of me that thinks, if I'm a civil rights activist in the 60s, race blind as a concept sounds really great. I would love for society to be genuinely race blind, but from the context of the 1960s, do I trust all of the universities that are currently shutting their doors to black students to just say, okay, we'll do it based on class? wink, wink. And then, like, do I trust them to actually, judge that fairly? I don't know that if I'm a 1960s civil rights activist that I would. And so I sympathize with some of them who said, well, no, you just explicitly need to admit black people, and we're not going to let you dance around with some other metric that you're just going to abuse. Maybe from our view of the, 2024, that seems a lot more reasonable. But from the 1960s, I can see why they wouldn't trust that, I guess.
Yeah, no, that's a fair point. In the 1960s, we were not far from, Bull Connor and fire hoses and really terrible, terrible mistreatment of black people, not just by individual leaders, but systemically. The schools were highly segregated. Uh, there was massive resistance to desegregation. So I'm sympathetic uh, to the concept or to the argument that a racial wrong uh, requires some sort of racial remedy. I think what that ignores, though, is ultimately 2 points. One is that there were terrible uh, negative consequences uh, to uh, to employing racial preferences. I mean, it was incredibly unpopular policies. They always have been, and continue to this day to be very unpopular. So it results in a backlash that can be very dangerous. And the other point is that when you look at the empirical evidence, you can get high degrees of racial representation, racial diversity using economic metrics. Uh, and Universities claimed that that wasn't true for a long time because it's much cheaper for them to admit privileged students of all colors than it is to provide any kind of economic affirmative action. Uh, but but the research going back many years has found that if you're intelligent about your class-based affirmative action program, that you can produce the positive benefits of racial diversity without all the toxic negative effects of racial preferences. And the key here, this may be a little getting into the weeds too much, but there are certain socioeconomic factors that better capture the history of slavery and redlining and segregation that you were talking about. So if you look, for example, at concentrated poverty, not just family income, but whether someone grows up in a neighborhood where most people around them are poor, that provides more likelihood of racial diversity. The same is true when people are applying to college, at least. You have access to their information about their wealth, that is, their accumulated assets. Wealth is handed down from generation to generation. And so that better captures the history of segregation and redlining and slavery, and therefore is much more likely than an income-based kind of an unsophisticated income-based affirmative action program that might end up, producing less racial diversity than we want.
Let's talk about what the research actually shows, because I do find myself sympathetic to these arguments, especially from the lens of 2024. Like I said, I think the strongest argument in favor of an actual race-based system would be stuck in the 1960s, that at least back then, for some period of time, maybe explicitly racial system, racial preference had to happen for a little while. Maybe I could be convinced of that. In 2024, I think it's harder to argue that. Um, but let's talk about the actual numbers of what we see, because I think it's important to see who's actually benefiting from the the current system, the system that we have right now in universities, the system that existed when racial quotas were still around, because they have been, my understanding is they've been overturned by the Supreme Court at this point. But who benefits from the racial quotas that existed up until very recently, and who would benefit under a class-based system? And are they the same people? Are they slightly different people?
Great question. Very different groups of people. So, for many, many years, uh, selective colleges brought together essentially, upper middle class and wealthy students of all races. Now that's better than all white classes that are wealthy, uh, but it was invariably upper middle class and more privileged Black and Hispanic students who benefited from racial preferences. So to give you one example, at Harvard, almost three quarters of the Black and Hispanic students came from the most privileged one fifth of the Black and Hispanic populations nationally. So you brought in a lot of uh, sons and daughters of Black and Hispanic doctors and lawyers. Kind of the quintessential case was, does Barack Obama's kids deserve do Barack Obama's kids deserve a preference? And Obama's own answer was no, that they are pretty privileged.
To make fun of somebody who I like quite a lot, this is the Matt Iglesias route to Harvard to some extent, where Matt Iglesias went to Harvard, and he himself has talked about this. I think that, obviously he likely benefited from the fact that he was Hispanic, but he's a pretty white guy. Like, I'm pretty sure he identifies as just being a white guy most of the time, and his dad was well off. His dad's an essayist, grew up in Greenwich Village, hobnobbing with the cultural elites and all that. So, like, Matt Iglesias talks about this openly, but he's a great example of, like, the kind of underrepresented minority who actually ends up at Harvard much of the time.
Absolutely. That's that's the that's the classic type of example of who benefits, and and that makes economic sense for Harvard because they don't have to provide much financial aid to Obama's kids, to the young Matt Iglesiases, and so there was a rationale for their type of program. Uh, but if you look at the rhetoric around affirmative action, when supporters would talk about the types of students they saw benefiting, they would give examples of, you know, working class Black and Hispanic students who managed to overcome odds and, you know, went to under-resourced schools and, that's who's benefiting. No, that wasn't the case at all. Now that the Supreme Court has struck down racial preferences, universities that are committed to sustaining racial diversity have to find new ways. And so under the new programs, we see for example, at Harvard, the percentage of first-generation college students has tripled in the last decade or so while Harvard was the subject of this litigation. So it's not that universities are going to give up on racial diversity. To their credit, they are committed to making sure that their institutions are racially diverse. But now they're going to do the hard work of actually finding uh, really talented, low income and working class students of all races, a disproportionate share of whom are Black and Hispanic, who will have the doors open to them for the first time.
There was an interesting statistic in your book, and this varies college to college. So I don't actually have the page in front of me. I'm going to paraphrase. Forgive me if I get the exact number wrong. But, it's at a typical elite college, like an Ivy League college or near Ivy League, like MIT or Duke or something like that. You'll typically have, I don't know, 10 to 15% of the student body is underrepresented minorities, Black, Hispanic, Native, etc. And so you'll have this, ratio of, like, what is the, say, naively, like, the white to Black or ratio or something like that. And it's pretty sizable. It might be like 10 to 1 or something like that. But at a lot of colleges, if you look at the rich to poor ratio, it's actually much, much more. That there are colleges where, the upper quartile versus or the upper quintile versus the lower quintile is something like 30 to 1. You're 30 times more likely for a student to be, upper middle class than lower class, which is, it really kind of raises the question, what do we even mean when we talk about diversity in a sense?
That's right. The diversity uh, at universities is defined in phenotypic terms. Uh, the photo that shows racial diversity is enough in the view of many universities, and they're not going to get beneath that skin color to look at whether you actually have students who have dramatically different life experiences, students who you have some students who are going to be privileged, but then where's space for the students who've faced real obstacles in life. And so at some of these institutions you have a majority minority student population, and yet you'll have 20 times as many rich students as low income students. So in essence, they're racially integrated but economically segregated. And I think uh, it is already beginning to change now that the Supreme Court has struck down racial preferences. My liberal friends have a hard time wrapping their heads around this concept, but I think there's a lot of evidence to suggest that a conservative Supreme Court decision on racial preferences is actually yielding a liberal public policy result, which is that universities are taking steps that they'd never taken before to really open the doors to working class students.
It may also depolarize the the university setting to some extent to have people from different socioeconomic backgrounds it represented more. And it's something I worry about because even as a liberal, like I don't think it's great that in our university systems, you go to Harvard and you're far more likely to run into a black person at Harvard than you are to run into like an actual ideological conservative. I remember there have been surveys about this where like the number of conservatives among Harvard faculty are like less than 1% or something like that. And so maybe a side benefit there is that if you have people from genuinely different classes, that polarization doesn't happen as much. I don't know, because I think that the drawing from monolithically kind of the upper middle class and upper class for our most prestigious universities is part of how they got so polarized in the first place. But anyways, that kind of thing aside, there's kind of a big silent population that we haven't been talking about yet, and that is Asian American students. When you talk about university admissions, they are kind of the awkward minority, so to speak. The minority that, if we did absolutely nothing with class or race, they would probably take up a disproportionate amount of seats simply because they tend to do very, very well academically. You can even see this, I think, there's certain California universities, and California's banned affirmative action for a long time, where Asians make up like a third to half of the student body. And so without kind of prejudging that, I'm curious how you think about it, because it seems to me factually like it's going to be the case that if we move away from this system, we're going to see Asian Americans heavily overrepresented simply because Asian American students tend to do so well. Is that something we just say, great, good for them? Is it something we are concerned about, not concerned about? Just how do you think about Asian students in general?
Yeah. Well, let me make 2 points. First, going back to your point about ideology, I think you're absolutely right that with economic diversity will come viewpoint diversity, ideological diversity. You know, the Today we have the so-called diploma divide, where those who come from more privileged backgrounds skew left politically, and so having students from all walks of life will help depolarize the environment on campuses, which is in the interest of everyone, including liberals. The liberals on campus will get a much better education when they actually have to, you know, develop arguments in support of what they believe, rather than just kind of getting a free ride because everyone else at the institution is liberal. I'm glad you raised the question of Asian Americans, because it's an enormously important piece of the affirmative action puzzle. So Asian Americans are very inconvenient to the liberal arguments around racial preferences. The Ibram Kendi on the far left has argued that uh, every racial disparity is the result of racial discrimination. Well, that's hard to square with Asian Americans representing, 75% of Stuyvesant High School in New York, the selective high school that students test into. Does that mean Asians are doing something nefarious to discriminate against non-Asians to have that disproportion? Uh, so, uh, so Asian Americans help uh, give lie to the idea that all racial disparities are directly connected to racial discrimination. Now, your other question has to do with, well, is it a good thing if, with the end of racial affirmative action, um, Asian Americans become, more overrepresented at institutions? And I'd say a couple of things. One is I'm uncomfortable with the idea that uh, there are institutions where there are quote unquote too many uh, of a group that has faced discrimination, after all, in this country. Um, so I certainly don't want caps on Asian representation. Um, the other piece, though, just to you know, think about the implications of economic rather than racial affirmative action, is that yes, the penalty against uh, Asian Americans is removed when you move away from racial preferences. But at the same time, uh, the data show that uh, Asian American Asian Americans are disproportionately from more advantaged economic groups. Obviously, we're talking about millions of people. That lots of variation within the Asian American community, but on the whole, uh, the income and wealth of Asian Americans is higher than whites. It's not clear that in all cases Asian American representation will increase with class-based affirmative action. The whole notion is to try to get fairness and to try to uh, identify true merit, and so I think we may in some cases see increases in Asian representation, other cases decreases.
Yeah. If there is kind of an opposite to, the hypothetical of like Barack Obama's kids, as the stereotypical person who is wildly overadvantaged in a race-based system because, Sasha and Malia Obama, they're doing fine in life. They don't need an extra hand up, right? If there's an opposite to that, I actually don't think it's, the coal miner's son from Appalachia, the white coal miner. I tend to think it's the poor Asian immigrant, the Hmong kid, or, I grew up and I knew several less economically advantaged Filipino families. And, it being a poor Asian trying to get into college isn't like, you can get a 1450 on your SAT and they'll be like, yeah, for an Asian, that's nothing. You're not going to get in anywhere. They've all set a cap on how many Asians there can be. And you're competing with, 1,000 Indian doctors' sons or whoever that all have extremely high SATs and all the tutoring in the world or whatever. That's just an interesting point. I think that if you want to point out one group that's really screwed, you can look at poor Asian kids, who have really gotten the bad end of the stick there.
Yeah, and they would benefit from a class-based, system, whereas the Asian American son of a doctor doesn't come out ahead under a system that newly recognizes economic disadvantage as part of the equation. So I think it'll ultimately depend on, it's hard to say Asian Americans will be hurt or benefit. I think some lower income Asian Americans will benefit from a class-based system. Upper income Asian Americans won't be quite as well off.
One thing that comes up sometimes, and this is a complaint that, I'm going to let you answer it. I think I know where you're going to head with this, but it's something that I hear people talk about, and frankly, I'm sympathetic to them, which is, why do we spend so much time talking about the Ivy League? I'm so sick of Ivy League bullshit. And, like, frankly, some of this is not about the policy. Some of this is not about affirmative action, but it's about, like, oh, a student protested at Columbia or Yale, and now it's gonna be front page news across the country that, some blue-haired kid at Dartmouth has an opinion on something. And a lot of people are sick of it. Like, why should we care? Shut up about the Ivy League. I think the statistic is that less than 0.1% of undergraduate students in America go to Ivy League universities. Less than 0.1%. So why do we care so much about what happens there? No, this doesn't affect my life. It's not going to affect your life or your kids' lives, or and maybe your kids, Rick. They're probably pretty smart, but I went to a state school, and so that's something that I hear people say sometimes. So what would you say to people who are like, shut up about your, high society nonsense. Nobody cares.
Yeah, well, I'd agree in part and disagree in part. So I will agree in part that, uh, that media institutions, other folks spend too much time talking about a tiny number of schools. I've spent a lot of my professional career working on efforts to increase the financial support provided to community colleges. Those are the institutions of the aspiring middle class in America. They're incredibly important. They have poor graduation rates, and there's empirical research to suggest that if you invest more in them, that they'll have a positive effect. So I agree with you. If you care about inequality in America, uh, then it's really important to focus on state-run institutions and community colleges. Uh, so why then am I writing a book that has to do with selective colleges? It matters who goes to elite colleges because they disproportionately provide America's leadership class. Like it or not, there is research finding that uh, roughly half of government leaders and half of business leaders come from just 12 highly resourced colleges in America. And I quote in the book, former President Biden on this question, where he says, there's a river of power in America. Most people don't know about the river. Um, some people want to get in but can't. And that river of power runs through the Ivy League. Now, the irony, of course, is Joe Biden himself went to state schools. He was very proud of the fact that he was not an Ivy Leaguer, and talked about that. And that's something, it says something good about our country that he wasn't.
Famously, he went to the University of Delaware. He's from Delaware. I think both for undergrad and for law school. He did not go to a highly ranked law school, although that's a whole nother separate issue, is how many lawyers we have in democratic politics, and I won't get started on that, but yeah, continue.
Yes, but if you look at who he hired, his administration was stacked with with people from a small number of colleges, many of them Ivy League. So that's in part why it matters. It also matters in the sense that we had these leading institutions in America, uh, that have a lot of prestige that were openly saying we're going to count race in deciding who gets ahead, and most Americans hate that idea. And so beyond kind of the practical impact of, uh, having an influence over who's gonna get into this narrow set of colleges, the Supreme Court's case set a tone that, is likely to have a much, much broader impact, than just on selective colleges. I mean, we're seeing now, uh, businesses and others who are moving away from racial preferences in their hiring, in their programs because of this Supreme Court decision that happened to involve, Harvard and University of North Carolina, a couple of very selective colleges.
I'd love to talk about the politics of it because several times here throughout this conversation, you've mentioned the unpopularity of any system that is explicitly racial, that explicitly says we're going to have a quota or we're going to give members of a certain race like extra points on their applications, whether that's for a job or for a slot at a law school or anything like that. Those do tend to be very, very unpopular. And I think they've been unpopular pretty much as long as they've existed from the 1960s forward. And it's honestly a little bit surprising and, either in a good way or a bad way, depending on your point of view, I guess. It's been surprising that it survived as long as it did. Something that is a 65-35 issue normally does not survive for like 3 or 4 decades of solid work, but we got 3 or 4 solid decades, maybe even more of affirmative action policies, and it's just always been unpopular. Do you think that there's evidence that a class-based approach, even if you say outright, we're going to do this class-based approach, and it will also allow us to admit a lot of Black and Hispanic kids, and that's partially the goal, but it will be based on class. Do you think that will be more popular? Do we have any evidence there?
Yes, there's lots of evidence over the years, when a group of voters is polled on the question of racial preferences, we find often 2 to 1 opposition. When that same group of people are, uh, polled about whether it's okay to give a preference to economically disadvantaged students of all races, you get 2 to 1 support. So, so this is, it comports with most of our public policy. I mean, if you look at a program like Obamacare, which, was rocky in the beginning, but now is widely popular. It's, it's a program that says you get extra consideration, extra subsidies based on your income, and people accept that. They accept that we have a progressive income tax in this country where certain people are, taxed at higher marginal wealthy people are taxed at higher marginal rates than those who are more disadvantaged. Uh, if you tried to apply that based on race, if you said, "Well, Obamacare is gonna be we're gonna give the biggest subsidies to privileged Black people, and we're gonna have different tax rates, marginal tax rates based on race rather than class." It'd be unconstitutional for one thing, but it would be enormously unpopular as well. And it's been an albatross for Democrats for decades. When President Obama made those remarks about his own kids didn't deserve a preference and he'd rather that economically disadvantaged students of all races, get a break. I went and worked with one of Obama's key staffers, and I said, "How can I help? I've been writing about this. I'd like to help him develop that policy." And she came back and said, "Listen, there's no way he's gonna go against, racial preferences given the interest group politics of the Democratic Party."
And Rich, if you're talking about something we can blame on the groups, then you're speaking my language, man. You know how to speak directly to my heart.
Well, this is a classic example of the groups or what Rui Teixeira calls the shadow party, which boxes Democrats into unpopular positions. But in theory, at least, the Supreme Court decision ought to be liberating and ought to, now a politician can go to the groups and say, listen, I'm with you on racial preferences, but it's not legal anymore. So therefore we got to come up with alternatives.
I think this is kind of the key to good, however you want to phrase it. There's progressive ways and there's more moderate ways to phrase this. But if you want to talk about racial justice from a progressive angle, or if you just want to talk about helping people, yeah, helping the everyday person, it's probably a more moderate way to say it. But the way that actually works politically seems to be to have blind programs that, like you say, are aimed at lower class people. And because black people and often Hispanic people are sometimes overrepresented there, they end up being disproportionately helpful to those groups. And so, things like the child tax credit and Obamacare and, a Medicare expansion, those are real racial justice programs in a sense without ever having to say a word about race.
That's right. And the public opinion research on this is very, very clear that when liberals try to racialize a policy, it becomes less popular. And so the way to make progress in this country, even if your only concern is about race, is to employ the language of economic status. Now, I like that poor Asian and white students also benefit from class-based affirmative action. That's a good thing in my view. But I also appreciate and see it as an advantage that this will, class-based preferences do provide a disproportionate benefit, as Obamacare did, to people who've suffered a lot in this country, that is Black and Hispanic populations. So both things I think are true.
So we've got just a little bit of time left. I want to ask one more question about something that really grinds my gears. And I guess I have two questions about this. And that is the special form of affirmative action that we give to rich white people at certain colleges, and that is legacy admissions. And I'm gonna call this like the water polo loophole, where there's like very weird upper class white person sports like fencing or water polo or lacrosse, where it's a very limited population of people who do this stuff. And it's almost all very upper class, very wealthy white folks. And the amount of I guess here's two questions for me because the whole thing pisses me off. So I'm going to ask you to talk about it rather than me just ranting. Number one, to what extent is this a factor in like determining the student body at these elite universities? What percentage of the student body comes via way of this kind of legacy admission or like weird sport that nobody else plays, the yacht club or the rowing club or whatever? And is there any hope that this is going to be reformed, or is kind of the interest group here, which is organized upper class people who donate lots of money, is there any hope that we can defeat that interest group and get that out of college admissions?
Yeah, those are great questions. So back in 2010, I edited a volume about legacy preferences called "Affirmative Action for the Rich." I think there are strong arguments for and against race-based affirmative action. I ultimately come down based on economic affirmative action, but in the case of legacy preferences, to me, that's much closer to a slam dunk. I mean, this is heaping advantage on an already advantaged group. As a basic matter of fairness, very, very hard to defend. And the same for uh, these boutique sports, water polos, squash, crew, that tend to be a way for elite universities to bypass need blind education. They say they're need blind, but then they make sure that there are certain slots which they are pretty sure that there'll be full pay students for, very affluent students. So these are among the most troubling aspects of college admissions. There is a weird symbiotic relationship between racial preferences and legacy preferences, preferences for wealthy athletes, preferences for the children of faculty. They all go together in this sense. You know, Racial preferences provided a chance for universities to be racially diverse and provided political cover for these very troubling legacy preferences and preferences for elite sports. Um, that now is all called into to question. The With the end of racial preferences, there's now enormous pressure on universities to get rid of these preferences for the wealthy white students. We now have a number of states, including California, that have banned legacy preferences. As I said, I'd been fighting against legacy preferences for years, tried to get state legislators and civil rights groups interested. No one would do anything about it. But now that racial preferences are gone, legacy preferences have come under attack. And we've seen a number of institutions drop their legacy preferences. Basically there used to be about half of colleges that provided legacy preferences. That's down to a quarter. It ought to be zero, but we're moving in the right direction. So I think I know there was an unholy alliance between civil rights groups and universities where universities provided racial preferences that made civil rights groups happy, and then civil rights groups left legacy preferences alone. They said, "We're not going to challenge them." That deal is off. And now civil rights groups, to their credit, are going after legacy preferences. So I think it's just a matter of time before institutions end these really shameful practices.
I hope so. I mean, I am skeptical simply because the money is such a factor. Money talks, and there was one anecdote in your book where you made it seem like, oh, if you're an alumni and you just donate enough money, you can just get your kid into a certain university. And I think you said that people like wrote in, not in outrage, but specifically asking, wait, how much? And like, what's the price? How much do I need to donate to get my kid into Yale? Like,
That's right. Yeah, Dan Golden wrote a Pulitzer Prize winning series in the Wall Street Journal on this question, and he thought it would spark all sorts of outrage, and instead people asked him, "Yeah, what's the price? What does it cost to get into Stanford?"
self-interest is a hell of a drug, I will say. I think this has been a great conversation, and if you're out there listening and you are middle class or not one of the most advantaged people, you're probably hoping that Rick's approach to college admissions works, and that people take it up. And if it doesn't, I guess you better get your kid playing water polo, because that's what we got right now. So, I want to thank my guest one more time for coming on the show, Richard Kahlenberg. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jeremiah. It's been a delight.